All right, let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel 3. Hope everyone's having a good week. It's good to be with you tonight. Always encourages me and lifts me up to be together with you on a Wednesday night. In the middle of the week, it's just a needed break from the world. Daniel chapter 3. Recall where we've been in Daniel. Through chapter 2, we got into some depth about the statue that was in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and what the different parts of the statue meant and represented. And when you pick up at the end of chapter 2 in verse 46, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, after Daniel tells the dream and the interpretation of the dream, Nebuchadnezzar is very struck by this, isn't he? He's very, very struck by what Daniel has done. In verse 46 of chapter 2, he falls on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him offerings and fragrant incense. And he says in verse 47, the king says to Daniel, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to recall this mystery." So Nebuchadnezzar, it appears here, begins to see something about the true God. Would you call him a believer at this point? That's probably a stretch, right? I think probably the case is that he does have some belief in the true God, but he's probably still giving his attention and worship to all these other gods of Babylon. And God, the true God, is just another one of these gods, perhaps, in his mind. So we get to chapter 3, and I would just like to read the first few verses, and we'll do this again where I'll read a few verses and we'll comment, and then we'll take the next batch of verses. So in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Isn't it interesting that Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a giant statue, and now here, I don't know how long after this is, after chapter 2. Some people think maybe a few years, some people think maybe 20 years. It's hard to say. Here he is erecting this giant statue. But what's different about the statue versus what he dreamed about? Ben? Yeah, do you think there's some meaning to him in this? It's all gold. Why might that be? This is speculation, but I think it's pretty solid speculation. Why would he make it all of gold? Remember what the gold represented in the dream? His kingdom. Yeah, the head is of gold. That's your kingdom. So maybe it's this not so subtle way of saying, oh, this is the kingdom. There's not going to be another kingdom. I mean, we're going to make the whole thing out of gold. The statue was 60 cubits high. How long is a cubit? Best we know. 1.5 feet, so we're talking 90 feet high. That's a pretty tall statue. But it's only 9 feet wide. It's a very slender, tall and slender statue made of gold. Some people, they make a big deal for some reason about how skinny the statue would have been. 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. But it could have been that it was on a very tall base, so that it did look more like a human figure with a tall base. Truth is, I don't know why we talk about all that so much, because we just don't know. But we know it was 90 feet high, and it was 9 feet wide. There's this list of government officials in verse 3, satraps, prefects, governors. These words we're not exactly sure how to distinguish them and what the functions were of each one. Satraps is probably a governor of a province. So what is Nebuchadnezzar doing? He's getting all the government together, all the government officials, and basically it's sort of a loyalty test for all the government officials and for all the people. So when all the music plays, what are they supposed to do? Look at verse 5. You're to bow down and worship the golden image. Now, what was the image of, do you think? Do you think it was of Nebuchadnezzar himself? Was it his likeness? Was it maybe one of the Babylonian gods? I don't know the answer to that either. I don't think the text really makes it clear. But whatever it was, they were to worship it. Fall down and worship when you hear the music. So here are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They have a big choice to make here. Are you going to bow down? Or are you going to stay true to faith in your God? Another thing a lot of commentators I think they spill a lot of ink over, is where was Daniel? Daniel, as we go through the story, he's not mentioned. You think Daniel bowed down to this statue? No. I don't think so. Knowing what we know about Daniel. And you probably think of 100 explanations of why Daniel is not in the story. Was he not even in the area? Maybe he was serving in the palace while this is out on the plain of Dura. Maybe Daniel had risen so high in the dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar that he was exempt from this. Maybe he was traveling on business. The bottom line is, there's no way that Daniel would have bowed down to this statue. But look at verse 8. Let's read on. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. You can tell these Chaldeans, they're sort of really out to get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're not just reporting what happened, but did you notice what they said? These men, king, they're disregarding you. They're ignoring you. And how do you think that makes a king like Nebuchadnezzar feel when someone ignores him and doesn't listen to him? And, I think it's probably the case that these men would have served the king faithfully. They had been serving the king. They were not disloyal to the king. But they had to draw a line, didn't they? We're not going to worship the king. We're not going to worship this image. You have a thought, Ben? Yeah. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Ben's pointing out that he gives them a second chance when he hears this. He calls them in. Why do you think he did that? I mean, because he is mad, right? He's very angry. If you look at verse 13. Yeah. Right. They were, and he saw already that they were way smarter, way more intelligent than all the other young men who got appointed to things. So they were valuable to Nebuchadnezzar, but he's still very angry. Bob? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think he likes Daniel. I think he likes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but his pride is getting in the way here. And so he's in a rage, if you look in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. And he gives them another chance, as Ben pointed out for us. Just one more chance. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" This should not have been a surprise to him, right? That they would not worship his gods. They went through the whole thing about how they wouldn't eat the king's fancy meals in chapter 1. And Daniel had made it very clear in chapter 2 that he serves the living God, the true God. He's asking them, is it true? Is it true that you won't worship the image? And now, verse 15, now if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? Whoa. He's got a pride problem, doesn't he? What God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? He's making himself equal with a god. Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's godlike. What God can deliver you from me? See? So, what are they going to do? Put yourself in their situation as we read through this. What would you do? What would you be feeling and thinking as all of this happened? Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." That's some strength right there, isn't it? The king of the known world and all of his power. And these guys maybe were still very young, young men. There's some strength here, isn't there? And it's a quiet, sort of reverent strength. Notice they're not saying anything out of line to Nebuchadnezzar. They're not. They don't feel any need to explain. They're not begging. They're not arguing. They're not doing any of that. They just said, "This is the way it is." Basically, you do what you're going to do, and this is the way it is. We're not going to worship your image. Ben. Yeah. Right. Now he's really mad, right? Yeah. He offers mercy and they still say no. And I think also it's interesting to think about Nebuchadnezzar had been good to these guys and put them in good positions and everything, had honored them in that way. Doesn't that make it even harder for these three men to say no? I mean, here's this king, he's been good to me. He's helped us. He's done good things for us, and I have to stand here and tell him, no, I'm not going to worship. That's just how it is. There's no explaining, there's no begging, there's no any of that stuff. It's just, we've made our decision. Ben.
I think that there's a lot going on. Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging God's power in this book, but he never stops to follow it.
Right.
Whereas Daniel, they're following God, and that's his mind. He's following the king.
Right.
And there's that disconnect.
Yeah, that's probably a lot of what's making him angry, that they're following God and not him. And Nebuchadnezzar, isn't he such an interesting fellow? He says things that we've seen already, and you're like, yeah, he's getting it. He's finally learning. And then he does things like this. And then you get to chapter 4, and he messes up really bad again with his pride and arrogance. And he just doesn't learn very quickly, even with everything that he sees going on with these men. Other questions or comments so far?
Well, I think right along we see that Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that God is a very powerful God, that it mentions, a God of God, not the God.
Right.
He's one of many gods. He's obviously a pretty good one.
Yeah.
That doesn't make him top dog.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to say it. Your God is a pretty good God. He's pretty powerful, but he's just one of many, as you said. Julie. Yeah. Right. Isn't that amazing? Julie quoted from Job, "Though he slay me, I will still trust him." And so that is an amazing thought, that he said they have no doubt God can deliver us from you. And they tell the king that. Look at verse 17 again. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." That's interesting, because they have in their mind that they could die, and yet they still say, God is going to deliver us from you. And then in verse 18, "But even if he does not," they realize God may have other plans, and he may not deliver them from the fire. It may cost their lives, but God will still deliver me. God will still deliver us. "But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up." What do you learn from that statement? Even if he does not. Yes, they're humbling themselves before the Lord. Yeah. Very true. Very true. And there are things more important even than life, aren't there? Than our physical life. And this is more important. I'm going to serve God even if it costs me my life, because there are things more important than my life. And I think it's hard for us to understand that. I think we know that. But again, put yourself in that situation. What would you do? Would you be able to stand there and say this? Would you be able to be strong under all of this pressure with your life on the line? But I love that statement, even if he does not. Let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods. Questions, comments? We're going to circle back to this toward the end of class and try to make some applications for ourselves. But for now, let's go on to verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. How do you think that looked? Now he's really mad, and his whole face changes. He's just angry. He's full of wrath, and he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. I mean, what hope do they have? Tied up, thrown into the fire. Notice some of the details that show what a dire situation this is. It was 7 times hotter. They heated it up 7 times hotter than normal. They tied them up. They left their clothes on, and I read that normally the clothes would be removed before they threw them in, but the king is so mad. He doesn't even care about that. Just tie them up, leave their clothes on, tie them up, throw them into the fire. And then, of course, you know what happens. Verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men that we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." There was a 4th person in the fire, but not a person, was it? It was an angel. It was a supernatural being of some kind from God. Some think this was even Jesus Christ pre-incarnate. I don't know if that's right or not. But here's this angelic being in the midst of the fire, and they're not harmed. They're walking around in the fire. Their hands are loosed, and they're walking about in the midst of the fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair on their heads singed, nor were even their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. What do you think the reaction was? I mean, can you picture this scene? You read over it so quickly, but just picture it. They don't even smell like smoke. Not even a hair is singed. And it shows the power of the Almighty God. Nebuchadnezzar is struck by it again. Come out of here, you sons of the Most High God. I mean, he's struck by the power of their God. But it doesn't last long because we get, again, you see what's coming in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. There's little clues in there, as Bob was pointing out earlier. Notice he's very struck by God, the true God, but he says things like, "There is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." So I think in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, like this, their God may be the most powerful God of many gods. So he's not there yet, but he's very impressed by the whole thing. Ben?
Well, I'm struck with the fact that since these guys they're in the fire, and then he gives them a command, right? He tells them to come out,
Yeah.
come to him.
Yeah.
They can fly, right? Like there's that acknowledgement power, but there's still that understanding, right? Like
Yeah.
this is whole attitude of the and it seems to me like obviously he talks about the God of the people. He doesn't actually say like doesn't address it like the God of the Hebrews or like Jews or
Right.
the great I am, like their God. Like
Yeah.
more like the results and that.
Yeah, that's true. He has a limited view, doesn't he, of what happened. Bob?
So go back to verse 25 here, about the fire out. I'm thinking about the burning bush right at the moment. Back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. The angel of the Lord appeared in flames of fire.
Yeah. And in a bush that did not burn. Bob's speaking of the burning bush for those online. The fire that burned but did not consume the bush. Yeah. Other thoughts, comments? I'll give you a lot more time to comment as we go along. I wanted to show you, I tried to do some research on what this fiery furnace may have looked like. I didn't come up with much, but this is what someone thinks it might have looked like. And I think it's plausible. It's a kiln. Some people think that the furnace was probably used to smelt the gold that was used to make the statue. And then it had a double purpose. They used it also to punish anyone who would not worship the image. And some think that there was maybe a hole in the top where they were thrown in, but there was some opening or door on the side, as we saw in the text, because Nebuchadnezzar is looking in there and he's calling out into the door. And so perhaps it looked something like this. I really don't know for sure. Let's talk about some lessons. Think about the story and let's talk about, first of all, what lessons do we learn from Nebuchadnezzar? And this, of course, would be what not to do kind of lessons. What do we learn? What are some takeaways for us?
Don't be too proud.
Yeah. He's got a big pride problem, doesn't he? And arrogance. And yeah, good point. He's got these Chaldeans that are, they're wicked. Be careful who you surround yourself with. Be careful about pride. And when good things happen in our lives, we're in danger of becoming prideful because of our success. We're in danger of forgetting God. We're in danger of treating our friends poorly, perhaps. I think you've got to watch out for pride, and you've got to watch out for anger, unrestrained anger, especially that kind of anger that is born out of pride. right? Because you see that in Nebuchadnezzar. He gets very angry and makes some bad decisions in that anger, like trying to execute these men who were so good to him and faithful to him in the sense of being good subjects. They were intelligent. They could have helped him tremendously. And he gets so mad, he throws them into the fire. He gets so mad, he throws some of his valiant soldiers. They end up getting killed because of his anger. The fire is so hot it burns them and kills them. And I didn't think of the one EJ mentioned, but that's a great point. Be careful who you surround yourself with. That's true for all of us. It's true, really, if you're in a position of power, too, for sure. What do we learn from the three men?
Faith.
Yeah, faith. What kind of faith does it take? I'm going to turn this off. It's probably not picking me up well down there. What kind of faith does it take to stand up to a king like Nebuchadnezzar? What kind of faith does it take to give your life for? Yeah, it's tremendous. It's something we should aspire to. They had tremendous faith. I mentioned this already, but I like their quiet strength. They're not disrespectful to the king. They're respectful of who he is. They're not begging for their life. They're not trying to rationalize it. They're not trying to explain it. And they just speak very plainly to him. Sometimes there's a time for very plain speak, very plain talk. And they exhibit this. We need to be like them and decide who we're going to serve. Do you think that they decided in the heat of the moment, as this was going down? Do you think that's when they made the decision that they were going to serve God? No. No, that's not going to work out well, is it? To do it in the heat of the moment. No pun intended. We have to decide now, when things are good, when times maybe are easier for us, that I am going to serve God no matter what happens. We have to figure out what is right and what is true and stand on it. Make a decision and stand on what's right and what's true. And don't be moved off of it, even if it costs you your life. Easier said than done, isn't it? But we've got to be building ourselves up, preparing for that, or it's not going to go well for us. What else do we learn from these men and their example? Yeah. Yeah, what a great point. They drew strength from one another. A lot harder, right, if it was just one of these men standing there alone. But I can... Right, yeah, what if one caved? Yeah, right. It makes it much harder. And I picture them when the music starts to play and the announcement is made, that they're looking at each other like, what are we going to do? And they're encouraging one another. We can't do this. Stay strong. We can't do this. So it's a lot of strength that we can draw from one another. Ben? Right. Right. Yeah. Their point of view was on the eternal, wasn't it? That not the temporary things of this life. That's the outlook we need to have too. Very true. Good point.
We can
Yeah,
Sunday, Wednesday, or Sunday night.
yeah,
Christian fellowship and
right.
talking with each other.
Yeah, we draw strength from one another at times like these. And to just know that in a crazy world that we live in, that there are other people here that we can rely on, that believe like we believe, and we can be encouraged by and draw strength from. We need each other. Great point. Well, will you bow down? Aren't there things that people want us to bow down to today? Gods and idols of this world and this life. What idols are out there today? I think of the horrors of abortion, and I think about how in Old Testament times, even at times, the children of God would sacrifice their children in the fire to Molech, the god Molech, burn their children alive as a sacrifice to him. And in a sense, it happens today, doesn't it? We sacrifice, this society sacrifices children to the god of convenience and the god of pleasure. And it's just a slaughter of innocent life. There are gods of self and gods of money and gods of pleasure. And people are going to tell us more and more as we go through this life. I think more and more this is going to happen. You can't say that. You can't talk about that. You can't think that. You can't believe that. Right? And they'll tell you this. Are you going to bow down to their gods? We have to be deciding now. We have to be strengthening ourselves now, because I'm afraid times are coming that are not going to be easy for us. Right. That's the flip side of the coin, isn't it? We're not going to bow down, but we're going to stand up. Stand for what's right. Even if it costs you, stand for what's right. Not easy, but that's what we're called to do. Stand for what's right. Be salt and light in this world. Don't be afraid to speak up. And you don't have to do so obnoxiously, but when you have an opportunity to stand for what's right and to say what's right and to speak the truth, we need to take those opportunities and not be afraid. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think you're probably right. Greg is saying that one of these men was probably the speaker to the king. And this emboldens the other two men, right? They're feeding off each other, no doubt. And you see somebody stand up, you see somebody stand for what's right, and there's so much nonsense in this world, so much sin, so much evil in this world. And we need to be ready to stand up and say what's right, say what's true.
Never want to hide our Christianity to the world.
Yeah. Never want to hide our Christianity. Yes. We are salt and light, but we can't be if we're silent, if we don't stand on what we believe. Well, what if it cost you? What if it cost you your job to stand for what's right? What if it will cost you friends to stand for what's right? What if it'll cost you your money? What if it cost you your life? Are we ready to do that? Jesus told the church in Smyrna in Revelation 10 and 11, you know this one, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He goes on to say, he who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. So there are things worse than losing your life. And to deny God, to deny the faith in order to save your life, I hope it never comes to that for us, but we just don't know. And I think there's a temptation, I was thinking about this earlier, there's a temptation for us that maybe we would say, okay, if I were in these men's shoes, I would just pretend like I was worshiping the idol and then not really mean it, and that would be okay. What do you think about that? I would ask God for forgiveness after. What do you think? Kind of tempting, right, to our human mind, to our flesh. Right. Yes, what effect are you having on the others around you if you were to do that? It's not going to encourage, it's not going to strengthen anyone to do that. What if they kill you anyway? And you've denied the Lord, and they kill you anyway. And Jesus said, you know, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. And he wants us to stand firm. Now, well, that's all I want to say for now. Ben? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. That's true. Maybe you think, well, nothing will happen right away, but it's bad all around to do something like that. Bob? Yeah. Yeah, true. True. You're sowing destruction, right? Dave.
You know, it's really hard to understand when a person becomes a Christian and they fall away. Years later, they might be faithful Christians and they might know the Word really well, and then all of a sudden they fall away. And get lost, lose their way to heaven.
Yeah.
You used to have a guy working for the Pat Boone,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
he's a Christian and he baptized people in his backyard in school. He worshipped with us here, but
Oh, really?
he fell away.
Yeah.
All the things he knew, and then gave up on God.
Right. And we can give up on God when things become hard, when we have to take up our cross, when we have to suffer. So instead of it being a time of building camaraderie, as Greg pointed out, a time of strengthening one another, a time of growing, because growing, you know, it takes pain, it takes fire sometimes to grow. You can either do that or you could lose your faith. And I'm just saying we need to be ready. We don't know what's coming for us in this world in the future. But we need to be ready. Will God deliver us today? Well, it's a trick question. Will God deliver us today? If we're faithful to Him, will He deliver us? Oh, yes, He will. Will He always make it so that we don't die physically? No. No, I don't want us to go away from the story of these men and say, well, God will miraculously, powerfully save my physical life every time. Because can you think of examples in the Scriptures where that wasn't the case? Where people died because of their faith? Stephen, yeah. Stephen is a prime example. There are many examples, right, in the Scriptures where people lost their lives because of their faith. I was thinking of James in Acts chapter 12. the Apostle James. He was put to death, but what happened to Peter, who was imprisoned with him? Peter was set free. James was put to death. Now, why is that? I don't know. God knows the answer to that. I don't know. But one gave his life and one was set free. I was thinking of the church in Smyrna and Philadelphia. They were both faithful to the Lord. This is in Revelation 2 and 3. But Smyrna, God tells them, Jesus tells them, you're going to have to suffer, even though you've been faithful to me. Philadelphia, he says, I'm going to spare you from what's coming. Why is that? Well, that's in the plan and purpose of God. And we don't always know. Thinking of Antipas, I'm thinking of Hebrews chapter 11, verses 35 through 38, at the end of Hebrews 11, where it talks about men and women of faith and how they were sawn in two, how they had to live in caves, how they were put to death. So don't think, well, if I'm faithful to God in this situation, he's going to miraculously save my life. He may, but he may not. But will God deliver you? Yes. He'll deliver you, because it's not just about physical life, is it? There's much more at stake than that. And I'm running over, I just realized. I apologize for that. But think about this as you go home tonight. How can we find this kind of strength that these men exhibited? Give that some thought. We'll get into Daniel chapter 4 next week. Thank you all.